I was standing by the window, facing the soft, creamy light that spilled through the sheer curtain like it had nowhere else to be. My blouse opened just enough to make me feel exposed, not indecent, but far from how I ever presented myself in public, or even at home. And then his voice came from behind me, low and certain, almost like it was brushing against my skin. "Undo one more button." Yes, like that. And I remember how my fingers trembled, not because I was nervous, but because I wasn't. I didn't hear the shutter. Maybe the camera was down. Maybe he never lifted it. But I felt his steps as he came closer, quiet but decisive. And then his hand settled gently on my waist like he'd done it before. Like this wasn't the first time, even though we both knew it was. And for a moment I forgot I was married. Forgot I had bills in my purse and lasagna defrosting at home, and that I was wearing my husband's name on a medical card tucked inside my wallet. It started earlier that week in one of those private Facebook groups where women my age passed around book recs and tips on anti-frizz shampoo. Someone posted about a gallery in the Arts District, offering free photo sessions for women over 35, something about empowerment and soft lighting and capturing your real self. And I'd been feeling invisible for a while, not in a dramatic way, just the slow kind where even your reflection starts looking like a stranger you wave to out of politeness. So I signed up, told Brian I had a club meeting. He said something about a client call and left the kitchen with a thermos and his Bluetooth in his ear. We hadn't had a real conversation in months, not one that didn't involve utilities or something broken in the house or why I wasn't sleeping right again. He used to touch my back in the mornings. Now it was just the click of his belt and the sound of the front door locking behind him. The studio didn't look like a studio. It smelled like bergamot and old wood, with dusty canvases leaned against a wall and soft jazz playing low from a corner speaker, like someone had been living in that space for years and only recently decided to let others see it. Adam introduced himself with a handshake and a smile that didn't stretch too wide, but sat just long enough to make you think it was sincere, and he called me Miss Claire like I was someone meeting him at a hotel bar for a drink neither of us planned. He asked what I'd brought, and I showed him a few things. A cream blouse, jeans, a necklace that hadn't left my drawer since our 10th anniversary trip to Mendocino. He looked at them the way someone might look at the inside of a piano, technical, not critical, and then handed me something from a hanger behind a curtain. It was a silk wrap, pale gray with a neckline that wouldn't survive a breeze, and he said, "Try this, something that feels like it could slide off if you wanted it to." When I came out, I expected him to be behind the camera, but he was watching me, not through the lens, just directly. And he said, "Stand near the light. Let's not pose anything yet, just be." I did what he asked because there was something in the way he spoke, not commanding but clear, and for a woman who spent most days answering emails with words like "please review attached," it was oddly comforting to be told exactly what to do. He adjusted a light, then asked me to close my eyes and think of something I wanted but didn't have. I didn't need to think long. The moment had already arrived. That photo, the one he showed me seconds later on the screen, didn't look like me, but it was. My jaw wasn't tight, my shoulders weren't apologizing. I looked like I had a secret, like I'd just been kissed by someone who hadn't asked for permission. He said, "You're magnetic when you forget you're being seen," and I laughed like someone had told me a joke I wasn't supposed to hear. I don't remember what prompted him to move closer. Maybe it was the way I tilted my head. Maybe it was the silence. But suddenly he was next to me, showing me the photo again on the monitor, pointing something out with one hand while the other settled low against the small of my back, resting. There just long enough for my breath to change, and when he asked, "Do you want to see what comes next?" he wasn't talking about the shoot. He wasn't touching me in a way that could be called indecent. He was just holding space, letting the moment stretch until one of us snapped it. Then his fingers slid along mine, tracing the length of each knuckle like he was memorizing how they curved, and in a voice just above a whisper, he said, "What would happen if we kept going?" And I didn't answer, not because I didn't know, but because I did. That night, I kept feeling the ghost of his hand where it had rested, like a touch that imprinted itself under my skin instead of on it. I told Brian I had a long client call and curled up on the couch with a blanket I didn't need, pretending to watch a baking show I couldn't follow. He came home after 10, kissed the top of my head like I was a child asleep on a long car ride, then showered and slid into bed without turning on the lamp. He didn't ask how the book club was. He didn't notice the subtle sheen still clinging to my collarbone. And I didn't offer anything. It's strange what makes a person feel seen. I've worn dresses to weddings that cost more than a weekend, getaway, spoken at meetings where men in suits nodded and scribbled, baked birthday cakes from scratch just to hear someone say, "You didn't have to," and none of it compared to the moment Adam said my name like it was the first time someone had spoken it out loud. I started replaying the session in my head like it was a dream that forgot to fade. The way the room was warm but not stifling. The way the light curved around my shoulder in the mirror. The way he never asked if I was okay, just assumed I could handle being seen. That weekend, Brian was out of town for a software expo in Denver. He texted me photos of the conference hall, all lanyards and badges and bad coffee. I sent back a thumbs up and a heart emoji because it's what couples do when there's nothing else to say. I thought about telling him how the shoot made me feel. Not about Adam specifically, but the way it shifted something. But the words died on the screen before I could tap send. He would have nodded, said cool, and asked if I'd remembered to reschedule the termite inspection. When Adam's studio email arrived on Monday morning, I opened it like a teenager checking for signs of a crush. "Your proofs are ready," it said, followed by a Dropbox link and a note in his handwriting scanned in at the bottom. "You don't need to smile to be radiant." There were 12 photos. In one, my eyes were closed and my mouth was parted like I was exhaling a thought I hadn't dared say out loud. In another, my blouse had slipped slightly off my shoulder, revealing more skin than I'd ever shown in public, but less than I feared. They weren't indecent, they were intimate, but the kind of intimacy that comes from being witnessed, not touched. Still, when I looked at myself, I blushed like I'd done something wrong. Or maybe something finally right. I stared at one photo for too long. The way my fingers were curved against the fabric, the way my hair had caught in the light, it felt less like a photo and more like a secret. I saved it to my phone, not to send, just to have. I knew that alone made it dangerous. Tuesday night, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror longer than usual, adjusting the buttons on my pajama top until they were a little uneven, like they might fall open if I turned too quickly. Brian was in bed already, reading the news on his tablet, nodding absently as I brushed my hair in silence. He looked up once, smiled, and said, "You look tired." I smiled back and said, "It's been a long week." It was only Tuesday. Next day, I got an invite from Adam for another session. This time in black and white, a different tone, something quieter, more internal, he wrote. "Only if you want," he added. But I didn't need the invitation to decide. I'd already chosen before I read the message. I told Brian I had an evening meeting at the Women's Finance Committee. He didn't ask what for. He just nodded, finished his coffee, and left with his laptop bag. There was no suspicion in his voice, no curiosity. That's the thing about being predictable for too long. People stop checking. At the boutique on Maple and Fifth, I bought a dress I would never wear to a PTA meeting, a soft, slate-colored thing that hugged in places I usually tried to hide. The clerk asked if it was for a date. I told her no, but she winked like she didn't believe me, and for once, I didn't mind. Driving to the studio, I felt my hands tremble on the steering wheel. Not because I was afraid of what might happen, but because I knew I wouldn't stop. The kind of fear that's dressed like anticipation. The kind that makes you forget where the line was drawn. I parked a block away, not because I had to, but because I wanted the walk. I wanted to feel the air on my neck, the sense that something was shifting, not breaking, not yet, but loosening. Like a button, like a promise. By the time I reached the door, Adam was already waiting. He held it open like a host greeting a guest he'd invited before he knew he would. "Welcome back, Miss Claire," he said. And just like that, I stepped inside. The next time I returned to the studio, I told myself it was for the photographs, for the clarity of black and white, for the softness it could bring to sharp places inside me that I hadn't touched in years. But deep down, I already knew it wasn't about the images or the excuse I gave Brian about a last-minute reading group meeting on civic literacy. It was about being looked at in a way that didn't ask for permission, didn't rush, didn't retreat. The dress I wore had sleeves to the elbow and hem past the knees, modest by any measure, but it felt like a question I wasn't ready to answer. As I stepped inside, the studio was quieter than I remembered, like it had been waiting with its breath held. Adam was adjusting a softbox, wearing the same dark shirt rolled at the forearms, and when he turned, he looked at me. Not the dress, not the makeup, not the nervous way I stood near the rack of props, but straight into whatever version of myself I was still pretending wasn't there. He didn't say hello at first, just walked slowly around me and tapped the top button of the dress. "Too polite," he said. "Let's see what happens when it's just honest." I hesitated, but only for a second, then undid 2 buttons, enough to feel the air against my collarbone. He raised an eyebrow, but said nothing, just picked up the camera and pointed it without lifting it to his eye. The shutter clicked once, then again and again, but I noticed his finger wasn't always pressing it. He was just watching me. I could feel it, not as an intrusion, but a kind of study, like I was being painted without paint, seen without interpretation. He moved a speaker closer and played something old and slow, a soul track I half recognized, the kind of music that fills a room without asking for attention. The lighting was low and diffused, and when he stepped toward me and said, "You look nothing like a wife today," something inside me pulled taut, but didn't snap. Maybe I'm not trying to, I heard myself say, and it surprised me, not because it was true, but because I hadn't planned it. He smiled at that, not with his mouth, but with his eyes, and set the camera down again, deliberately. The next moment felt suspended, like the second before a storm breaks, the exact breath between knowing something is about to change and deciding you'll let it. He reached up slowly, brushed a piece of my hair behind my ear, and let his fingers rest just slightly longer at the base of my neck. His palm was warm. My pulse flickered under his touch. He didn't move away. "Do you ever wish someone would just notice?" he asked, so softly I wasn't sure if I was supposed to answer or just feel it. I closed my eyes, not because I was afraid, but because I didn't want to break the moment by naming it. And when I opened them again, I whispered, "I think about this too much." He stepped closer, voice just above breath. "Then maybe stop thinking." I didn't answer. I couldn't, because every thought I had was folding in on itself like paper too creased to hold its shape. He turned me toward the full-length mirror and stood behind me. I could see both of us, not posed, not theatrical, but real. He didn't touch my skin directly, just placed his hand flat on my stomach over the fabric of the dress, anchoring me to the present moment. I saw how he looked at my reflection, not with hunger or conquest, but recognition, like he was watching someone resurface. In that mirror, I didn't see a wife. I didn't see a mother or a client service rep or the woman who folded socks in rows by color. I saw someone who wanted to be remembered, someone who might be capable of undoing herself just enough to feel alive again. He didn't say another word. He didn't have to. His hand remained still, and my chest rose faster than it should have. I felt weightless and heavy at the same time, like I had stepped onto the edge of something and wasn't sure if it was a ledge or a launch point. I drove home with my thighs pressed tightly together, the dress still warm where his hand had been, and the music from the studio still echoing in my head like it had sunk into my bloodstream. I sat in the driveway for 15 minutes, unable to start the car again, as if turning the key might break whatever spell had been cast in that room. I didn't text him. I didn't say thank you. I didn't look at the pictures he'd offered to send, but I couldn't stop replaying the look in his eyes, the feeling of standing in front of that mirror not as someone trying to hold herself together, but as someone who for the first time in years had permission to come undone. The next morning, I told Brian the club ran late and we ended up grabbing coffee afterward. He barely looked up from his email and said, "That's nice," then asked if I'd picked up almond milk. I said I had, even though I hadn't, because I knew he wouldn't notice until next week. That used to bother me. Now it just felt like part of the wallpaper, something I moved around, not through, in the bedroom. I hung the slate dress back on its hanger and noticed the way it still held my shape in the fabric, as if it remembered what I'd done, or what I'd almost done, and didn't want to let go. For a second, I thought about burying it in the laundry, hiding the whole moment under the scent of detergent and routine, but instead I laid it gently over the back of the chair near the window, the chair I never sat in, the one that caught the morning light just right. 2 hours later, a message lit up my phone. Just a single line from Adam. "Next time, I want you in something that makes you nervous. No emojis, no punctuation, just that." I stared at the words, so long the screen dimmed and locked. I didn't answer. I didn't delete it. I just sat there, heart tight in my chest like a fist. I went about my day like I was underwater, picked up dry cleaning, answered invoices, smiled at the barista who always remembered my name, but I kept hearing that music from the studio, that slow rhythm like a heartbeat behind a closed door, and I kept feeling that mirror image, the one where I looked like a version of myself I wanted to believe was still real. At dinner, Brian talked about new software licensing changes, something about mergers and scalability. I nodded and chewed and pretended to listen, but in my mind I was back in that room, back in the dress, back in the space between his hand and my skin. I felt something inside me shift again, subtle but irreversible, like a train being nudged, off its track not with a crash, but with a whisper. Later that night, when I went to the bedroom, I noticed something I hadn't expected. The dress, it wasn't just a reminder anymore. It had become a promise, one I hadn't spoken out loud, even to myself, but I could feel it, the weight of it, the invitation of it. I touched the fabric like it might speak, and for a moment I wondered if I'd imagined it all. Maybe Adam was just a man with a camera and a practiced voice. Maybe I was just a woman looking for something to interrupt the silence in her life. But then I remembered the way he didn't touch unless I leaned in, the way he let me choose where the line was, the way he looked at me not as someone who needed fixing, but as someone already whole, if only slightly forgotten. I crawled into bed and turned off the lamp. Brian was asleep already, turned away, breathing heavy through his nose like always. I watched the red light on the smoke detector blink every 10 seconds and thought about how quickly people get used to things blinking in the background. I didn't reply to Adam's message. I didn't have to. The answer was already there, folded into the fabric, stitched into the hem. When something makes you nervous, it means it matters. And maybe I was finally tired of not mattering. I didn't dream that night. Or maybe I did, but it felt more like remembering. When I woke up, the dress was still on the chair. The sun had moved slightly, and the light fell across it in a diagonal line, like a photograph waiting to happen. And I knew, even before I picked it up, that I would wear it again. I was standing near the back wall of the studio, the one with the aged plaster and the faint outline of frames long since removed, wearing nothing but a sheer wrap that felt more like breath than fabric. My shoulders bare, my feet cool against the floor, and my arms loosely crossed. Not from modesty, but from the strange anticipation that comes when you already know the moment is about to break open. And then I saw him move, not hurriedly, but with quiet intent, his hand steady as he reached up and untied the silk scarf around my neck, the one he'd placed there earlier with a casual grace that had felt anything but casual. And as he pulled it free and let it slide through his fingers, he looked at me not like a man about to take a photo, but like someone about to say something he couldn't take back. Then he leaned in just enough for me to hear his voice clearly, and said with a kind of certainty that bypassed thought altogether, "I want to shoot the part of you no one else sees." And before I could exhale, before I could blink or question or step away, he kissed me, not gently, not roughly, but fully, like a line that had been drawn long ago had finally been crossed not by accident, but by design. And when his lips found mine, I didn't freeze, didn't flinch, didn't think of anyone else. I just kissed him back with the kind of hunger that lives quiet and deep and only wakes when someone dares to name it out loud. Earlier that day, I had stood at the kitchen island, spreading almond butter on toast, watching Brian scroll through some article on his phone with that glazed-over look that meant he wasn't really reading, just avoiding silence. And when I told him I had a shoot day with the girls, just playing around, nothing serious, he barely nodded, murmured something about a quarterly meeting, and left without asking where, with whom, or why I suddenly cared again about something I hadn't mentioned in months. And while part of me had braced for suspicion, or at least mild curiosity, all I got was absence. That soft, quiet kind that feels worse than distance because it's already accepted you're fading. And I realized then that the version of me he still saw was frozen in time, framed by memory and function and nothing more, and that made me angry. Not because he didn't care, but because him not caring gave me the space to go through with it. By the time I arrived at the studio, my body was already humming with anticipation, not of what we might do, but of what we might not resist. And the moment I stepped inside and saw that the camera was still packed away, that the lights were dimmed not by accident but by intention, I knew this session was never meant for capturing images, only for testing what happened when the posing stopped and the looking began. And when he took my hand and ran his thumb along the inside of my wrist, I didn't step back. I didn't speak. I just let him. Because there was something honest in that touch. Something that said this wasn't a trick or a tease. This was recognition of longing, of restraint, of permission we had both been holding out like currency waiting to be spent. He guided me wordlessly toward the full-length mirror by the window, the one with the specks of dust you could only see when the sun caught it just right, and he told me softly, "Stand there, just look at yourself," while he moved behind me until I could feel the warmth of his chest without him making contact. And when his forehead gently touched the back of my head, not in a way that pressed, just rested, I felt my knees tremble, not from fear, but from the weight of being truly seen, and for a second I thought I might cry, not because I was sad, but because I couldn't remember the last time someone had looked at me like I was more than a function or a fixture or a familiar obligation. I kept my eyes on the mirror, watched the way his reflection softened the space around mine, noticed how his breath warmed the side of my neck without moving lower, how his hand hovered near my hip but never claimed it, how he waited, not impatiently, but with that rare kind of stillness that says, "You decide." And then he turned me slowly, gently, until I faced him, our hands not quite clasped, our bodies not quite touching, and in that silence, no jazz, no shutter clicks, no murmured instructions, he leaned closer and said, "Only if you want it." And the moment those words left his lips, I knew they had nothing to do with guilt, or games or chasing desire, and everything to do with the fact that for the first time in years, I was the one who got to choose. I kissed him before I had time to second-guess it, before I could tally up the consequences or think of Brian or what this meant or didn't mean. Because when your body recognizes something your mind has been trained to deny, there's a kind of surrender that feels less like weakness and more like truth. And as my hands slid up to his neck and his arms finally wrapped around my waist, I felt not scandal, not danger, but warmth. So much warmth that it made me forget what month it was, what rules I'd broken, what lines I'd erased just by letting myself want. His lips moved over mine in a way that felt like discovery rather than demand, the kind of kiss that starts slow because neither of you wants to rush what you've already been waiting for too long. And as the air thickened around us and the light caught the edges of our reflection in the mirror beside us, I could feel the gravity in my chest shift entirely, not downward into guilt or shame, but outward like a pulse that radiated through every inch of skin he dared to touch. And when his hand slid to the side of my thigh, not rushed, not pushing, just resting there with fingers splayed like he was holding something delicate and fragile, I let my body press forward, not to close distance, but to feel anchored in the moment we had just chosen to step into. The kiss deepened as his fingers traced the line of my ribcage, not with intention to remove or possess, but as if he was mapping it for memory, and I reached for his wrist instinctively, not to stop him, but to hold him in place, because part of me feared that if he let go, I might stumble backward into the version of myself I thought I had to keep performing, and there was a brief second when we both paused, not because we had to, but because the silence between breaths felt louder than anything we could say. And I looked up and saw something in his eyes that wasn't seduction, wasn't conquest, wasn't even romance, but something softer, something almost reverent, as if he was surprised I hadn't vanished the moment he stepped close. He pulled away first, just a few inches, his breath still warm against my cheek, his thumb grazing the edge of my jaw, and he whispered, "This is yours to lead," like it wasn't a test or an offer or even an invitation, but a statement of truth. And I nodded, not because I understood everything that was unfolding, but because I didn't want to pretend I was still asleep inside my own life. And though the space between us reopened slowly, I didn't move toward the door, not immediately, because the air still held his shape, and I wasn't ready to leave a room that had finally made me feel like I was more than background noise in my own story. I stayed for a few more minutes, touching the edge of the mirror, smoothing the silk, wrap over my arms, listening to the way the walls seemed to remember our silence better than they ever remembered the flash of the camera. And when I finally stepped outside, the evening had fallen softer than usual, as if the whole world had conspired to dim itself so I wouldn't have to return to bright lights or direct questions. And as I drove home with the window cracked just enough to let the cool air hit the back of my neck, I felt the echo of his voice repeat in my mind, "Only if you want it." And I realized how long it had been since anyone had reminded me that want and need weren't the same thing, but that both were allowed. When I pulled into the driveway, the porch light was already on, the upstairs windows glowing dimly like the kind of life that runs on autopilot. And for a second, I just sat there gripping the steering wheel, wondering what my face looked like, wondering if I could walk inside without carrying that kiss into every room. And when I finally opened the front door, the scent of detergent and lemon cleaner greeted me like a cover story I hadn't asked for, and Brian was sitting on the couch in his usual position, remote in hand, ankles crossed, with the same gentle fatigue on his face that had lived there since tax season began. He looked up as I took off my shoes, eyes scanning my face not out of suspicion, but habit. And after a beat he said, "You're glowing. You okay?" And there was no accusation in his voice, no tension, just a genuine observation delivered like someone noticing you'd lost weight or found a better moisturizer. And I smiled faintly, the edges of my mouth tight from the effort, and answered, "I'm just tired," because it was the only version of the truth I could give without setting the room on fire. Later that night, when he fell asleep before me, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror with the light low and stared at my own reflection for longer than necessary, brushing my fingers lightly over my lips, not out of guilt or nostalgia, but to remind myself that it had actually happened. That it wasn't fantasy or wishful thinking or some hazy indulgence, and what stared back at me wasn't a stranger or a sinner, but a woman with flushed cheeks and wide pupils and something new behind her eyes. Not shame, not confusion, but heat, a quiet kind of heat that refused to cool, even in the stillness of our too familiar bedroom. I turned off the light, slipped back under the covers beside my husband, and listened to the steady sound of his breath, even and unbothered. And though I didn't touch him, I watched the outline of his shoulder in the dark and wondered how many versions of me had passed beside him unnoticed over the years, and how this new version, the one who had kissed someone else and not looked away, would ever be folded back into the life I'd left behind just hours earlier. But I knew the answer already. She wouldn't. I couldn't sleep that night no matter how many times I adjusted the sheets or shifted the pillow, or told myself that what happened didn't change anything, because something had changed, not just between me and Adam, but inside my own skin. And I lay there beside Brian, who breathed steady and warm like always while I stared at the dark ceiling, counting my own heartbeats, until I finally gave up and slipped out of bed barefoot, careful not to wake him, and padded to the kitchen with my phone clutched tightly like a secret I hadn't decided whether to keep or confess. I sat at the table with the glow of the screen lighting only part of my face and scrolled through the photos Adam had sent after. Our first session, the ones I had saved and hidden inside a private folder with a name that sounded like boring receipts just in case Brian ever asked to borrow my phone, and as I flipped through the shots one by one, I paused longer on the ones where I wasn't smiling out of politeness or performance, but where my mouth curled just slightly because I had forgotten to pretend. And the strangest thing was that I didn't look younger or thinner or better in any dramatic way. I just looked real, like the version of me that used to laugh too loud at dinner parties and dance barefoot in the kitchen on Saturday mornings when the coffee was just right and the world felt small enough to hold. My phone buzzed, and for a second I thought it might be a system notification or a sale alert or some automated reminder, but when I saw Adam's name on the screen and the small audio icon underneath it, something shifted in my stomach. Not panic exactly, but a tightening that made me hold my breath before pressing play, and then his voice filled the quiet kitchen, low and close like he was speaking into my neck instead of a microphone, and all he said was, "Tell me you're not coming back." But it wasn't a dare or a joke or a plea. It was a truth wrapped in velvet, and I sat there frozen with my thumb hovering over the screen until the message ended in silence that stretched far too long. I didn't save it. I deleted it before I could think too hard, before I could replay it and wonder if his tone had shifted or softened or cracked in places I missed the first time. And then I opened a new message, typed, "See you Thursday," and hit send without adding a period or a name or even an emoji because I didn't need to decorate what was already clear, and in that moment I knew I'd already made the choice I kept pretending was still undecided. At breakfast the next morning, Brian poured coffee into the chipped blue mug I always used and placed it in front of me without looking, then took a bite of toast and said with half-chewed casualness that we could get away to Vermont that weekend, just the two of us, no laptops. Maybe stay at that inn we liked with the creaky floorboards and the porch swing that overlooked the lake. And I stirred my cup for longer than necessary before saying I had too much work, some quarterly filings that couldn't be moved. And he nodded without pressing further, which somehow hurt more than if he had protested or questioned or even raised an eyebrow, because his acceptance wasn't trust, it was distance disguised as grace. When Thursday came, I stood in front of my closet longer than usual trying to pick something that didn't look like a choice but still felt like one, and I settled on a soft gray bodysuit with long sleeves and no back that hugged more than it hid, then slipped on my coat and drove to the studio with the windows cracked just enough to let the late October air curl around my neck like a warning I refused to hear. Inside the studio, the lights were already dimmed and the space smelled of cedar and dust and something faintly citrus that I couldn't place, but that somehow reminded me of the way nervousness tastes just behind your tongue. And Adam didn't greet me with a kiss or a compliment or even a glance that lingered. He simply gestured toward the set and said nothing, his eyes calm but unreadable, and I stepped out of my shoes, out of my coat, and stood barefoot on the rug without asking for direction. There was no music this time, no gentle bass line or soulful track to fill the pauses, only the sound of fabric shifting and skin brushing against skin, and the soft hum of light fixtures warming in the ceiling as Adam moved toward me slowly, with the kind of restraint that makes every inch feel louder. And when his hand reached my shoulder and traced the edge of it down to the bend of my neck, he didn't speak or smile. He just lowered his head and let his lips press softly into the side of my throat, a kiss so still and light that I barely felt it before it deepened into something I hadn't expected. Not urgency, not need, but depth, as if he was memorizing the way I responded before I even had the chance to. I stepped closer, pressing my forehead to his chest, not to hide, but to feel grounded. And in that closeness, I realized that whatever lines we thought we had been dancing near were gone, erased not with fire or chaos, but with silence and soft contact. And I pulled back just enough to meet his eyes, searching for the flicker of doubt I half hoped would be there. But instead, I found only reflection, the kind that shows you not who you are, but who you've been pretending not to be. And before I could think better of it, before I could second guess or stall or slip back into the protective numbness of routine, I said, "Can you record this?" And he didn't ask what I meant. We never spoke again during that hour, not even in whispers. It was all sensation, all slow unfolding, like we were carving out a version of ourselves that had existed only in fantasy, and now finally found form. And when it was over, when the camera light blinked off and the silence returned, we didn't rush to cover ourselves or apologize. We just stood there, forehead to forehead, breathing each other in like memory. He offered to send the file. I said no. I asked him to give me the SD card, and he did, placing it gently in my hand as if it were a fragile gift or a dangerous object, depending on how I chose to use it. And I tucked it inside my purse without a word, kissed him once more, softly this time, almost out of gratitude, and left the studio without looking back. Driving home felt like floating through a different version of my own life. The streets familiar but slightly askew, like a dream that mimicked the real world too closely, and I kept glancing at the passenger seat where my purse sat zipped tight, where the small black card nestled between lip balm and receipts like it didn't carry the power to shatter everything I had built, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, with proof that didn't need explanation. At home, Brian was in the garage organizing the tool shelf he never used, and I kissed his cheek on the way to the bedroom, pretending to check emails while I opened my phone, copied the video to the internal drive, then deleted it from the device entirely, double-checking to make sure it left no trace, no thumbnail, no name, and I told myself it was done, that no one would ever see it, not even me. But what I didn't know, what I had no way of knowing, was that in my rush to erase and hide, I had forgotten that last week I had borrowed Brian's spare flash drive to move some large files, and after the upload, I had tucked it into the inner pocket of my purse without thinking, without labeling it. And now it sat there quietly, holding more than data, holding the beginning of the end, waiting for morning, waiting for him to find it. Don't know how long he stood there watching the screen, but I know the room was silent, the way only a room can be when it's no longer part of your life. And I know he didn't make a sound when he found the folder on the flash drive marked with my name, the same drive he had used a dozen times for invoices and quarterly backups. And I know his breath must have changed when he opened it expecting spreadsheets and saw instead a single file with no label, no date, just a timestamp that matched the Thursday I told him I was working late. And when he clicked it and the video began to play, I know he didn't stop it right away. Not because he couldn't believe what he was seeing, but because part of him needed to see all of it to know it wasn't just some cruel misunderstanding. And I imagine the moment my voice came through, the speakers, and he heard the softness in my tone, the way I whispered instead of spoke. The way I looked at Adam like I'd forgotten anyone else existed. I imagine that's when the silence in his body turned to stone. He didn't confront me. He didn't call. He didn't leave a trace of himself in the room except for the absence. And when I walked through the front door later that day with my keys in one hand and a grocery bag in the other, humming a tune I didn't recognize but had been stuck in my head all afternoon, I felt it instantly. The weight in the air, the cold in the hallway, the stillness of a house where something irreversible had already happened. And when I stepped into the kitchen, I saw the envelope resting on the counter beside the salt shaker we never refilled, and inside was a folded sheet of printer paper with only one sentence written in my husband's blocky, even handwriting. "Is this what you wanted him to see?" I stood there for a long time holding that paper, like it might burn or tear or erase itself if I stared hard enough. And when I finally lowered it and turned to look around the room, my eyes landed on the suitcase, the large black roller I hadn't seen in years, sitting by the back door, zipped and upright, and I knew before checking that it was empty of my things, that it wasn't a threat or a test or a plea, it was a conclusion. And I opened the fridge out of habit and closed it again without touching anything, because the sound of the door clicking shut felt like punctuation. Upstairs, the closet was missing his side, the shirts, the travel bag, the 3 ties he rotated through like a cycle of compromise. All gone, with nothing left but hangers angled away from mine like they couldn't bear the contact anymore. And when I checked the bathroom, his razor was missing, and so was the cologne I never liked but always recognized. And it was only then that I noticed the blinking light on the answering machine, a relic we never used but still kept out of some nostalgic attachment to landlines in simpler days, and I pressed play with a trembling finger I couldn't quite still. His sister's voice came through sharp and unmistakable, her tone clipped and cold like she was cutting a thread she had been gripping for far too long, and she didn't scream or accuse. She just said, "You destroyed everything. Don't call, don't explain, we already know." And then the line went dead, and I stood there hearing the final click echo into the hallway like a door slamming somewhere inside, a part of me I couldn't reopen. I walked back downstairs and sat on the edge of the couch without really meaning to, letting my hands rest in my lap while the house settled into this new version of itself, one without footsteps above or keys in the dish or laughter from the other room. And I stared at the wall across from me where a family photo used to hang, one we had taken in Vermont, both of us wearing jackets too light for the weather, both smiling in a way that looked convincing from a distance. And I realized I had stopped seeing that picture a long time ago, even though it had never stopped watching me. I reached for my phone not to call him. I knew he wouldn't answer, but to open my calendar and scroll to Thursday to find the entry I had marked as client, portfolio update, and delete it, not because it would undo anything, but because the lie felt too heavy to keep carrying, even in pixels. And then I thought of Adam. Not because I wanted comfort or rescue, but because I needed to understand whether I had traded one version of absence for another, whether this story had a chapter left, or whether I had simply been an Interlude in a life that was never mine to keep. And without thinking, I grabbed my coat and my bag and walked out the door, not bothering to lock it, not checking the sky for rain, just moving because sitting still felt like giving up entirely. The drive to the studio felt like navigating through fog not because of the weather, but because every block looked slightly unfamiliar in the wake of what had just collapsed, and my hands clutched the wheel like they were trying to hold on to the last few pieces of who I had been only hours ago. And when I parked half a block away and approached the front steps, I already knew something was off. Not just because the lights inside were off, or because the usual soft glow behind the curtains was gone, but because the sign on the door had been removed entirely, leaving only a faint rectangular outline in the dust-covered glass that made the building look more like an abandoned rehearsal space than the place where my entire life had quietly unspooled. I knocked anyway, not out of hope, but out of habit. And when there was no answer, I cupped my hands to the glass and tried to see inside, and all I could make out were the corners of cloth-draped furniture and a few empty frames leaning against the wall as if they had once held something worth looking at but no longer did. And I stood there on the steps not knowing whether to scream or laugh or call his name even though I knew no one would answer, because Adam was gone, not just for the day or the weekend or the kind of pause that lovers pretend means space, but really gone. The kind of gone that doesn't leave a note, that doesn't explain itself, that vanishes as if it had never been real in the first place. Back in the car, I didn't start the engine right away. I just stared at the steering wheel while the silence inside the cabin pressed harder than it had any right to. And when I opened my phone to check my inbox for something, anything, that would anchor me to a version of reality that still made sense, I saw it immediately. An email from a legal firm I didn't recognize. Subject line, notice of filing, dissolution of marriage, and for a few seconds I didn't open it. Just stared at the bold text like it might fade if I blinked enough times, and when I finally tapped it open, there was nothing dramatic, nothing cruel, just formal language outlining intent, the inclusion of moral breach of trust as a basis, the clear implication that there would be no negotiation, no mediation, only process and finality. I didn't cry, I didn't call anyone, I didn't even get out of the car. I just sat there rereading the word dissolution until it lost shape, until it felt like something you might stir into water to make it disappear, and then I closed the app and drove without direction, passing neighborhoods I didn't know and storefronts I didn't recognize until the sun started to dip low enough that the sky turned the color of rust. And that's when my phone buzzed again with an alert from the gallery newsletter I hadn't unsubscribed from, the one I used to skim out of boredom during lunch breaks when I still thought I understood the shape of my life. The subject line read, New series, Women in Light, and beneath it was a thumbnail so small it took me a moment to register that it was me, not fully nude, not explicit, just enough skin to know it wasn't meant to be shared, just enough shadow to know it had once been private. And when I clicked through and saw the full image, the soft gray light across my shoulder, the undone collar, the way my eyes weren't looking at the lens but just past it, I felt my chest tighten with something I couldn't name, not quite shame, not quite fury, something in between, and below the image was a single caption in italic serif, she was never mine. That night, I didn't make dinner. I didn't return calls. I didn't reply to the lawyer. I walked through the house like a stranger trying to remember what belonged where, and when I finally made it upstairs and changed into pajamas I no longer recognized as my own, I entered the bedroom that no longer smelled like two people trying to make a life, and instead just smelled like fabric and stale silence. And I stood at the threshold for a long time before walking to the far wall, the one that faced the bed, the one where I had hung a framed photo from the second session at the studio, not because I meant to, but because it had felt like proof of something unspoken. In the photo, my face is partially hidden in shadow, one shoulder bare, hair falling, softly down one side, and I'm not looking at the camera or smiling or posing, just being. And for the first time since Brian left, I let myself really stare at it, not with pride or regret or longing, but with stillness, the kind that comes only after you've lost more than you can carry, and there's nothing left to do but sit in the weight of it. I turned off the light, lay down in the center of the bed without touching either side, and watched the frame glow faintly from the ambient light outside. A silent witness to everything I'd allowed and everything I'd broken. And as the room faded into darkness, I didn't reach for the blanket or the pillow or the memories, I just let it all settle, and I didn't move. The silence in the apartment feels different now. Not like peace or stillness or even quiet, but like the kind of absence that fills every corner with reminders of who used to walk those floors and what used to matter when the lights went off and someone else's breathing filled the space beside you. And now that space is mine alone, stripped down to the essentials I chose to keep, not out of sentiment or necessity, but because I needed to prove to myself that I could build something from what was left after everything else had been taken or had walked out on its own. I lost the job 2 weeks after the newsletter came out, not because of a formal complaint or a moral clause in my contract, but because clients stopped returning calls and emails started going unread, and eventually my supervisor sat me down in a beige office that smelled like printer ink and pity and said they were realigning with client expectations, which was just a polished way of saying nobody wanted to work with the woman whose photo had circled through local inboxes and message boards like wildfire. And I nodded and signed the paperwork and walked out without protest, not because I didn't care, but because pretending to care felt like one more layer of performance I no longer had the energy to maintain. At the grocery store, I keep my head down and wear the same dark sunglasses even when it's cloudy, not to hide exactly, but to avoid the stares that come not from strangers but from people who almost recognize me, from mothers who used to smile at me during PTA meetings, from old men who now look twice not because they admire but because they remember, and sometimes the kids, middle schoolers with phones in their pockets and too much time, whisper just loud enough for me to hear, not insults or cruelty but fragments of questions that sting worse. Is that her? And you think it's true? And once I caught a glimpse of a screen being shown in the back row of a cafe and recognized my own shoulder, my own mouth half open, frozen mid-laugh. One afternoon, I checked Instagram out of habit and saw a message request from an unfamiliar name, and when I opened it, I realized it was from Laura's son. Laura, who used to bring lemon bars to every neighborhood cookout and who once held my hand through a biopsy, and her boy, now old enough to type but not old enough to understand, Tact had sent exactly 6 words. Your mom is that lady, right? And though it wasn't cruel or crude or even mean-spirited, it landed like a slap across the chest because it meant the image of me, the version I had thought was private and intentional and temporary, had spilled into homes and screens and conversations I had never intended to be part of. I didn't reply. I didn't tell Laura. I just blocked him and deleted the app and stared at my reflection in the dark screen until it faded into nothing. My mother called later that night with the kind of voice people use when they're trying not to scream or sob or admit that they never really knew you, and she said, "We don't recognize you anymore. Who even are you?" And I stood in the kitchen with my hand on the counter and replied with a steadiness I didn't know I had, "I'm the same person I've always been," because I wasn't going to apologize for finally stepping out of the version of myself they all preferred, the wife, the helper, the agreeable daughter, just because it didn't look good in daylight. She hung up without another word. 2 days later, a letter arrived in a pale gray envelope with no return address, and I almost threw it away without opening it, but the handwriting on the front stopped me. Not because it was familiar, but because it was careful, and when I tore it open and unfolded the page inside, the words were written in clean black ink, each sentence spaced like it had been considered for hours before being committed to paper, and the first line read, "You were the story I never got to finish." It was Adam, not typing, not texting, not emailing, but writing with a pen like someone who knew he had disappeared without giving me the dignity of an answer. And in the letter, he said he left because he saw how I looked at him, not with lust or hope or fantasy, but with belief. And that belief scared him more than anything else because it meant responsibility. It meant consequence, and it meant we were no longer playing with ideas, but with lives. And that wasn't the plan. Not for him, not for someone who had made a career out of observing women and walking away before they asked for anything back. I read it 3 times before tearing it in half, not in rage, but in refusal. Refusal to give him the last word, refusal to let him frame the ending after stepping out mid-sentence. And then, an hour later, I taped it back together because even broken stories are still stories. And I folded it and placed it in the bottom drawer of the nightstand and turned the key that I hadn't touched in years. Not because I planned to revisit it, but because I needed to know that I had made the choice to remember. The neighbors have stopped pretending they don't recognize me, and now when I walk past them on the sidewalk or bend to collect the mail from the box that leans slightly forward from years of frost-heaved concrete, they no longer nod or lift a hand or even fake a distracted phone call. They simply avoid eye contact altogether, like the act of acknowledging me might somehow implicate them in something shameful or contagious. And though I used to bake for, these people used to watch their dogs and water their plants and offer warm casseroles when someone lost a parent or had surgery, now I'm just a cautionary tale in dark sunglasses and quiet footsteps. Someone whose name gets lowered to a whisper or substituted with that familiar phrase, you know, the one from the photos. And I wish I could say I was shocked by how fast respect turns to distance. But the truth is, I've seen it happen to other women too many times to still be surprised. The kids are worse, not in what they say, but in how they look, like they've seen more of me than I ever meant to share. Like I've been flattened into a series of images passed from phone to phone in cafeteria corners and behind the back rows of school buses. and though none of them say anything directly, I feel their eyes when I cross the street or wait at the II light or stand too long in the drugstore aisle searching for conditioner like I'm still allowed to take my time in public spaces, and some part of me aches not from shame, but from the realization that I can't ever explain the whole story to anyone who only saw the middle. I wear the sunglasses even indoors now, not because I'm hiding bruises or tears or the swelling of guilt, but because they've become a kind of armor, a way to create space where none is offered. And sometimes I catch my reflection in the storefront glass or in the black screen of my laptop when it idles too long, and I don't always recognize the woman staring back, but I don't flinch either, because what stares back isn't broken. It's someone who finally looks like the truth, whether the world likes it or not. One afternoon, I stood in front of the hallway mirror with the slanted frame and the chipped silver edge and watched myself carefully, not to assess damage or fix hair or adjust posture, but to see if anything had changed that couldn't be undone with a new outfit or better lighting. And I whispered out loud, just once, "The worst part is, I don't regret it." And hearing the words in my own voice startled me not because they were cruel or bold or untrue, but because they were steady, calm, almost kind. And in that moment I realized that what I had done, what I had lost, and what I had become were all pieces of the same shape, a shape I could live inside, even if no one else wanted to sit beside me. That evening, I opened the drawer I had locked weeks ago, the one that held the reassembled letter and the few physical things I hadn't thrown away, a flash drive, a faded business card with Adam's gallery email scratched out and no new one added, a contact so untethered it might as well have been blank. And I gathered the small collection and placed it all inside the old black portfolio I used to carry for client pitches, the one that still smelled faintly of paper and perfume and panic, and as I zipped it shut, I realized it was the only thing I had left that still carried weight without judgment. I didn't leave a note. I didn't make a speech. I didn't text anyone to say I was heading out because there was no one left to announce anything to, and instead I put on my coat, the one that still held the scent of early fall, and picked up the portfolio like it was just another part of my routine. And I opened the door without hesitating and stepped out into the street where the shadows were already growing long across the pavement, and I walked. I didn't know exactly where I was going. Maybe a cafe, maybe a print shop, maybe just somewhere with windows and tables and people who didn't recognize my name. But I walked anyway, not with purpose, not with shame, not even with defiance, but with the simple resolve of someone who understands that starting over doesn't always come with applause or grace or clean slates. Sometimes it just comes quietly, with an empty card and a set of photographs you no longer hide, and the sound of your own footsteps finally going forward.